Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the Analytical Corner. My name is Tom Chapman. I work in internal communications here at the fund. If you haven't had a chance to attend one of these sessions in the past, this is a new series that we're doing during the annual meetings to highlight some of the most innovative and cutting-edge work here at the fund and to hear about it directly from the source. So you'll hear about the researchers who are actually performing all of that. This afternoon for this session, we'll be hearing from Mauricio Soto, who is a senior economist in our Fiscal Affairs Department, and he'll be talking to us about the fiscal consequences of shrinking populations. I'd like to take a second to ask you to silence your cell phones and to encourage you to be very attentive and very inquisitive during his talk. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible, so we will reserve some time at the end for a question and answer period, so make sure that you're thinking about your questions while he's speaking. So with that, I'd like to invite Mauricio to the stage.
€2,540. That is how much each Irish citizen gets when they turn 100 years old. The government of Ireland, for your 100th birthday, would give you €2,540. Very generous. The luck of the Irish. This is not the case in every country. If you were lucky enough to be born in the UK, the Queen herself will send you a nice letter. On August 4, 2013, Miss Caitlin Shaw turned 100 years old. And this is what she got. A very nice letter signed by the Queen congratulating her for achieving her 100th birthday. Very nice, the type of present you will hang in your wall. Now, this seems relatively easy to do today, but can countries keep providing these presents to our populations? In Ireland, last year alone, 400 people turned 100 years old. It costs to the government to provide this benefit. They even have a name for it. They call it the Centenarian Bounty. The cost of providing the Centenarian Bounty was €1 million last year. Fast forward 85 years. There will be 10,000 people turning 100 years old in Ireland. So the cost of providing the Centenary Bounty will go from 1 million today to 25 million, just because of population aging. These letters, they don't seem like a big deal, but if you think about 1 second per signature, the Queen herself spends about maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours today signing about 10,000 letters. Fast forward 85 years, 2100, the Queen will have to spend over 3.5 days just signing letters, congratulating people. And these are not the only benefits countries provide to the elderly. This is really a minimum amount of what countries provide to the elderly. Most countries provide pension benefits to finance retirement, and healthcare benefits, which we expect to increase as people age. Older people have higher healthcare costs. Now, is that going to be a problem in the future? We know that today, in about close to maybe 30 countries, most of them the richer, advanced economies, Europeans, North America, some in Asia. In these countries, over 15% of the population, 1/5, is older than age 65. And let me stop here because I believe this is a great achievement to be able to live longer and healthier lives. In these countries, people are lucky enough to see their children grow, their grandchildren, they can see them going to school. And the good news is, this is not only exclusive to these countries. As we move over time, fast forward 85 years, you see all over the world, South America, Russia, Asia, even countries in Africa, on top and bottom, are aging. And they will share this privilege. This achievement will be shared across countries over time. Great achievement. Now, there's another achievement that is related to this that is often overlooked. And is that in many countries today, I think it's about 18 countries, in about 18 countries, most of them in Europe, the populations are shrinking. So the number of people in the population in 2020, in a few countries in the world, will be less than it is today. And remember, I call this an achievement because this reflects choices of households, that as household gets richer, they decide to invest more in their children than to have more children. Economists and demographers argue, but they really see this as a choice. As households get higher incomes, as education becomes more of a commodity, where human capital is important, the decisions are to have fewer children instead of less. This also reflects that there's better healthcare. People see their children growing to old age. And as I said, this is an achievement. And it's one of those achievements that will also be shared across countries and over time. The number of countries that will be declining by 2100, 85 years from now, is over 120 countries. It will be about 70% of the countries that we study. They will be declining by 2100. Extraordinary achievements. But we are the IMF, and when we talk about achievements, of course you know what's coming. Extraordinary achievements bring extraordinary challenges. So when we look at how much countries spend in pension and healthcare combined, in about 30 countries today, they spend over 15% of their GDP. Over 1/6 of their income is spent in these two programs alone. These countries are not collapsing in any way, but it's a substantial amount of resources devoted to take care of the elderly. Fast forward 85 years, and now you can see an intersection of declining populations and shrinking populations. And what will happen is the number of countries where the expenditure that governments devote to pensions and healthcare will be above 15% of GDP. In many countries, will be as high as 30. Even in countries in Africa that today might spend 2 or 3% of GDP in these two programs, it will go close to 10% of GDP. These are extraordinary challenges. So if the only thing that you get of this talk is one thing, it will be the following. You have increasing populations that are aging. You have moderating population growth, creates fiscal challenges. Now, of course, what can we do? And we as the IMF, how can we help countries to deal with this challenge? Imagine you're driving a car and you see this sign. You're driving, you're going to your destination, you see this sign. This sign is telling you that if you keep going in this road, you might fall off a cliff. Remember, it's not telling you you're going to fall on the cliff. It's telling you if you keep going in the same direction, you will fall off the cliff. You will eventually hit a cliff, and you will fall. When you see this sign, what do you do? Besides panicking, you can say, woo! But what do you do after panicking? We think you can do 3 things, and it's the same things that you can do to deal with the problem of aging. The first thing you can do, you see a sign, you take a U-turn. You say, never mind, I don't want to go there, I'll just turn around. In this context, this means bending the curve, and instead of shrinking the population, starting to increase them again. It happens that when countries have tried that in the past, providing financial benefits to have more children, providing more support for fertility, when countries have tried to do this, they have not been successful. So we have serious doubts that this can be a solution. And in this context, U-turn is prohibited. You cannot do it. This solution is not there. I said there were 3 solutions. The second one that we think you can do is to slow down. You see, you're driving, you see a sign. I would think the prudent thing is you slow down. Slowing down will not solve the problem. If you keep going in the same direction, you will eventually hit the cliff. And if you don't do anything, you will eventually fall. In this context, slowing down means with the same number of population, have more employment. And this requires increases in labor for participation of 2 particular groups. One is women, that when we look across countries, women labor for participation tends to be lower than that of men, particularly in the emerging and the low-income economies. There are several reasons for this, but we think that if this can get closer, that the labor participation of women gets closer to that of men, you are provided some time, at least to think of what are the solutions that you want to implement. The second group that you can increase their labor participation is the elderly. And here is strange, because it's not in the low income and the emerging economies. Here is in the advanced economies, where the elderly, and we're talking about people between 55 and 65, have lower labor for participation than younger workers. And there is not a real reason to do this, because as I said, people are living longer and healthier lives. When you compare the incidence of disability and other health components, this by itself doesn't explain the reduction in labor for participation of the elderly in these countries. So these are the 2 things that you can do. This will not solve the problem, but this will slow you down. It will allow you to think about other options. But there's only one option left, because I said there were 3 options. That option is you're driving, you see a sign, you slow down, thinking about it, but you know you eventually have to find a detour. You have to find another way to go around to get to your destination. In this context, this means reforming pensions and healthcare systems. We believe this is unavoidable, because if the pension systems and the healthcare system are kept in their current form, costs to the governments are going to raise to fairly unsustainable levels. I showed you many countries that reach 15% of GDP and more. If you think about it, to finance 15% of GDP, you will need to tax earnings maybe 30 to 40%. So each dollar that you earn, 40 cents will go to finance these benefits. Is this sustainable? If you're going to do through VAT, you probably need a rate between 30 and 40% as well. Can countries sustain this just to pay for these benefits? Countries need to do much more than provide healthcare and pensions. They need to do education. They need to do infrastructure. They need to provide defense. So this is an important challenge. Now, when you see the sign, as I said, you can panic. But it's also good news. And that's what we're trying to do here. The good news is that countries have seen the sign, and the IMF has been part of showing this sign to the world, to policymakers, and to you. You know that if nothing is done, the cost of providing pensions and healthcare system will reach very high levels. But we were doing projections up to 85 years. Countries have time to enact many of these reforms. And that's the good news. This is not an unsurmountable problem. This is just like a sign. You see it. It's not telling you you're going to fall on the cliff. It's telling you you need to do something, and you can start now. Thank you.
So, Mauricio, I'm going to start the question and answer period off. If people liked what they heard and they want to know more about your research, where can they go?
So this is the research is really featuring a much deeper analysis that we did across countries, and you can find it online. It's on the external website of the IMF. Easy way to find it, Google shrinking populations, IMF, it will be the first hit.
Great. So if anyone has any questions, please just give us your name first and let us know who you're affiliated with, in what capacity you're here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Sebastian Schobel. I work for German Public Radio. Obviously, for Germany and especially, Europe, you already mentioned that Europe is a very special case, a very urgent case, actually, when it comes to dealing with older population. Could you go into a little more into detail what you mean by pension reform, what that would entail, and maybe give us some more insight that you have on the European discussion, European debate. I know in Germany, for example, we talk a lot about having people simply work longer and have them retire much later than they used to. Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you. So the question is, what do we refer to when we talk about pension reform? It's a really wide question, but typically we see pension reform focus on the traditional, let's talk about the traditional pension system, like the one in Germany. There are three ways to address these issues in the pension system. One way, and the one that we think is the most attractive, is increasing the retirement age. As I said, this will prolong the career, and this will increase the number of years that people work, and it will shorten the number of years that people receive pensions. This has, besides the fiscal benefits, by lowering the cost of pensions, it has positive consequences for the economy. So we see it as a win-win situation, especially given that people are healthier and can live longer lives. So that's definitely one of the components. The second component is more difficult and politically is very challenging. When we look across countries, some countries are providing benefits that are relatively high. So the benefit formulas need to be changed so that benefits reflect better the amount of contributions that people have put into the system. The last option for pension reform is, why not in some countries, contributions are actually low. This applies to many emerging economies. The contribution rate for pension might be low. No surprise, pensions will be low as well. How this is actually done in countries is a different story, because each country obviously have their own pension system with their own pension formula. In Germany, what they've been trying to do is to make this more automatic. Instead of having policymakers every few years get together and decide on their wisdom what the actual level of pension is, what they decide is let's set a pension level or a retirement age that is consistent with our principles and what we want the pension system to achieve, but let's link it to some of these demographic or economic indicators. As the population ages, automatically you can change the formula, so the benefit that you receive in one particular year, let's say when you turn age 65, will be lower if you were to live a few more years. And that's one way of addressing the system. We see lots of merits to taking that approach, but it will be indistinguishable to parliaments coming every 5 years and doing the same.
I have a question. So what are some of the implications of immigration on this? Obviously, if a population is shrinking, but you're having more people immigrate to the country, that's going to have some sort of effect.
Tom, thank you. So you see it in my presentation, I didn't mention immigration. This is also an important, and thanks for reminding me about this. It's an important issue. The second solution was to increase the number of people working for the same level of population. So we know populations are shrinking, we want to have more workers. That will help address some of these issues. It will buy you time to do some of the more painful reforms. Immigration works in a similar way. It's obviously a more controversial issue because there are many other issues linked to migration that is not really the right scenario to do it, and we didn't really study that in depth. But we actually look at the consequences of migration to pension and healthcare systems. What happens is, as you have a wave of migrants, these costs are reduced at the beginning because you have lots of workers that enter into your economy. So it buys you time. However, it's not a solution because these workers will eventually retire with similar benefits that natives receive. And what this implies is if you have a formula that doesn't work, this is not going to be a solution. But it buys you time. It will give you a few years or decades where you can slow down and do the other more painful reforms over time. So we see it as part of the solution, keeping in mind that this is a more controversial issue for other factors besides retirement and healthcare.
Please. Right here.
The mic?
Sorry, I have the microphone, so I'll be the first to ask the question.
Go ahead.
This is Isabella from the Western Hemisphere Department. You're talking about the increasing retirement age, and I have a political question for you. The elderly have already worked, some of them for many years. They have a long contributory history. They will have some pension. You're making them work longer. What does it mean for the youth unemployment? What will the pensions of the young people look like in the future?
Thank you. So the question was from Isabella, thank you very much. If you increase retirement ages, the elderly are going to be working longer. What's going to happen to the youth? This is a common fear in many countries. They think that if you increase retirement ages, as the elderly work more, then the young are not going to work. And in an intuitive sense, seems reasonable. However, economists, and I personally don't think that's the case. When we look at the evidence, there is no correlation between the level of participation of the elderly or the young, other than economic cycles. That tells you if you have more elderly working, in many cases you also have many more young people working. So it doesn't seem to be borne by the evidence. And in a more fundamental level, what the evidence suggests is as the elderly work, they also consume. We are all workers and consumers. That extra consumption actually creates jobs and can help to develop economies. So we don't see the evidence. We understand the concern, but economists feel very strongly that this is not the case. And they even have a name for it. They call it the labor fallacy, because they don't really think this will happen. And so far, the evidence is on our side as economists.
Please, there's a mic.
Yes, I have the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Isabel Ortiz, I'm Director of Social Protection in the International Labour Organization. Now, it's true, societies are aging and societies change. But now, when we see also a trend that is decreasing natality, therefore, you will have a cut in expenditure related to education and children. So in a way, you could compensate and have a trade-off between aging population and actually decreasing expenditures in children, because they are simply decreasing. So there's something that needs to be observed to have a less alarmist type of message, because societies can adapt and offset one with the other. And at the United Nations, we have done estimations that actually it quite balances out. So, so instead of alarming so much on one aspect only, you should see the whole picture of the demographic change. Huh? That is one. The other is the issue of pension adequacy. Now, there are small parametric reforms that everybody agrees, the minor changes, you extend a bit the retirement age, people work longer, as part of healthier lives and all these things. But there is also the need to keep pensions adequate. If we only keep a fiscal objective in our minds and pensions simply get reduced because the only focus is fiscal, ultimately we are putting all these other problems at the macro level, that there is no sufficient demand, there is no consumption, and you are going to see poverty increasing in old age, which it will be very difficult politically in the countries. So the levels of pensions need to be maintained adequately. And that's something also that we observed, and also we do have simulations, and some of them are very worrisome because we expect pensions to be decreasing in many countries as a result of a number of continuous minor reforms. So what are we going to do now with an increasing aging population that becomes more poor? And it's not that precisely there are more jobs, because we are, slow growth, etc. So
thank you very much. I think this highlights a very important concern. When we talk about pension reform, as I said, there are three basic solutions. You reduce benefits, you increase contributions, or you work longer. In all of these three options, you need to keep in mind that one of the main objectives of pensions is to prevent old age poverty. So there's a limit to each of these options. In many countries, we observe that pensions are low and they are not adequate. But in many of these, what has been happening is that the contributions are relatively low. This happens in some emerging economies. Contributions are low, and there's an argument to increase these contributions to finance a more adequate pensions. In other countries, it's unavoidable. And there are challenges in how to do this, but protecting the poor has to be framed as one of the key functions of pensions. So when you reduce them, they will have to become more progressive. And this depends on societies. And to go back to your first point, because it's important, so again, there are three options, and protecting the poor should be kept in mind when you're executing any of these three options. The point about younger populations as a share of the total population, that's also declining as fertility rates go down. There is some room there that they will be offsetting some of these effects. However, and we're happy to see your numbers, when we have done this calculation, just the size and the magnitude of education, of spending in pensions and healthcare compared to something like education, tells you that it's not going to be a full offset, and we still think lots of pressures are going to be there. For some countries, that could be the case, but when we look at the wide averages, we see that there's not that much room that you could save, because it's not true that your education spending is going to come down. We already been through this process in many countries, and we don't see, because the already advanced economies that have already aged and have already lower fertility rates, we don't really see a decline in education spending. Theoretically, it could happen. If you count the number of children and you provided the same benefits per capita, it's probably you could reduce this and offset some of this cost. We don't see it in practice. And this is just because, as I said, as people have fewer children, their choices have changed. They have higher incomes and they want to invest more in each children. But we see some offset, but I'll be cautious in how much you can really offset given the magnitude of the increases.
We're in the middle of the transition. So what happens is some of the children are now in university age, so some of the education costs have been moved from primary education to tertiary education. And also because of unemployment, countries are putting more into tertiary education.
Correct, but as I said, it's not that this is going to come down. So, and we're happy to follow up after the presentation, but I think it's a very good point. We don't see it as a critical point that will offset most of the large costs that we project. And it's not to be alarmist. As I said, they are 85 years. These are very long-term projections. A lot of things can happen, but countries should start to do reforms now.
Miss, did you have a question?
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm from Global Voices Australia. We're a youth foreign policy organisation. First of all, I'm glad my mother's not here that you said 55 to 65-year-olds are elderly. My question, I'm a student of social science. So in Australia, there's a lot of age discrimination, and we're seeing that older people over the age of 45 are actually really struggling to find work and to stay within the workforce. I think it's a cultural issue, but I also think it's a skills gap. So if you're 40 years old now and in 30 years or 20 years you have to keep working, your skills aren't going to be keeping up with what we need, digital skills related to tech. So isn't there going to be an additional burden of having to retrain these people? I mean, is that a consideration you make in your economic modelling of how you're looking at things?
We didn't take into account that in this modeling.
Or just generally,
but
people get
yes.
older, we have to retrain people as the industries change, particularly in Australia, the way we're seeing a shift from manufacturing to service industries.
Correct. So there's really two parts to the question, and let me just repeat what I think the questions are. One is about age discrimination. It is really difficult when you're an older person, or not elderly, when you're an older person, to go and try to find a new job in a new area. And we recognize there are difficulties on this. Countries are facing with this. What we think is going to happen is, think about this room, right? If you look around, we are, different mixes of ages. But if you fast forward 85 years, many of us here will be much older because the nature of the population is going to change, the nature of the labor force is going to change. And employers and employees will have to handle this. There are legal changes that can happen, and there are challenges that we see mostly being progressed in the advanced economies. So there's legislation, anti-discrimination for age in the US. Similar measures have been taken in Europe and I suspect in Australia. But this is really a matter that the population is changing, the structure is changing, and we have, as employers, they have not recognized this yet. It will be unavoidable to some extent. Which leads me to your second question, which is our retraining. It's easy to say, work till you're 60, but skills change and industries change. And what we question also is the model of education today unique? And is it the optimal when you live longer lives? Today, if you think about it, in most countries, you are born, you go to elementary school, high school, some form of vocational or university training, and that's, for many people, the end of your education. Why does it have to be in this way? Why couldn't it be another education at some point in your life? In countries like Germany, training by the employer seems to be an important component and an important explanation of why their older workers can be more productive and remain competitive, producing maybe more expensive products that are competitive in the market, because these workers are constantly being trained by the employers. That model might not work in every country, but it makes you wonder whether more education at alternative points in life is appropriate. And we think there is scope to do that as part of the package to increase retirement ages and make sure that people can live longer, healthier, but also more productive lives.
Beyond education, what about the health effects of having, requiring in some cases, if the pensions are lowered to such an extent, of having older and older people working? Are we just assuming that people will be healthier and older, or?
So that's another great question. It's very similar to the question of protecting the poor. Not everybody can work longer. The truth is that there are many issues, distributive issues, of working longer. When you look at some countries, the gains in life expectancy are concentrated in those that are better off. So a policy that all that they do is increase retirement ages without taking care of this will increase inequality. And it's something to keep in mind. It's not the case in every country. In countries where the healthcare system might produce more equal outcomes, we don't seem to observe this. But in some countries like the US, this seems to be very clear, that the life expectancy gains are concentrated for those at the top of the income distribution. Those at the bottom have not gained as much. It's an important issue, and when health reforms are considered, when increasing retirement ages are considered, should be taken into account.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nadia Yunus with the Diversity and Inclusion Office at the IMF. And my question is a piggyback. I'm somewhere in the middle of your age and your mother's. Somewhere. But I want to piggyback on the social innovation and social movement around the shared economy, around different ways of working, and around reinventing yourself rather than retiring. Is there some convergence of these social innovations, things like phased retirement that hasn't really taken off and stuff like that? Are there new ways of working and things like that that could come into play here? And if so, are they being considered in the research that you're doing?
So not in this research, but let me tell you what we know in the literature so far. When you talk about elderly people, and when researchers talk to elderly people, yes, of course, what they want is they want to be able to work part-time, see their grandchildren, enjoy the benefits of aging, but not have a full-time commitment. The truth is that today that is very difficult. Most employers and most jobs are not designed in that way. The shared economy seems promising in that direction, but I'm not convinced it can be expanded to all activities in the way we produce them today. Some people are optimistic. They feel that as more technology comes and robots will take care of some of these tasks that need you to be there full-time, this might be an option. Some people, and I am more on the pessimistic side, that it's an ideal. You see it today, many elderly will tell you, why are you expanding? Because I need to be there 40 hours a week. If they were able to be there 20 hours a week and make the same on a prorated basis, they would probably stay in their jobs. But those jobs are very limited. And they're really exclusive, same sad story. They're really divided. Those that have very high skills, doctors, lawyers, sometimes they have those type of jobs, but some with low skills have them. For those in the middle, that option is very limited. And the question is, how can we ensure that employers and employees can have jobs that can help in that situation? I'm more on the pessimistic side, but there are two sides to this as well. So, thank you.
Should I follow-up question?
Yeah, just two quick questions. Do you think it's wise for a country to promise a certain standard for old ages, for pensioners, for people who are, like me, a little younger and are now asked to save for my retirement age because the government is not going to provide a certain level of pension anymore? So should we just do away with that promise and even be flexible when it comes to pensions and retirement age and tell people that ahead of time? And the second question is that pension something that can be dealt with transnationally, because we're now talking about national options. As a European, of course, the first question I have is there a European solution for that? I mean, just probably not in the EU, but...
Yeah, so the first question is about saving. As we have been saying here, governments should do a little less, maybe change benefits. Individuals should save more. In theory, people will save more. But in theory, you don't need pensions, because according to theory, individuals will be perfect foresight. They know they will have to retire, they will save on their own, and they will have their savings to spend. That's not what practice is. People fail every single step of the way. They fail to know how long they're going to live. They fail to know how much they need to save. They fail to know how much they're going to need when they retire. Even if you tell them, they will fail to contribute unless you commit them to do it. And that's what pension systems are trying to address, that failure that humans have to have this behavior that will actually be just like in theory. However, we have seen in some countries, as they implement these tough reforms, they provide incentives to people to save on their own. So we think it should be part of the package, but we're skeptic that that can be really the only solution. First, it will not work for many people. If you think about low-income workers, it will be very difficult for you to ask them to save more. Ideally, they should, but they have other short-term priorities that might be more important. But as we make the system more progressive, and as we protect those in the bottom, you might require from those who are middle income or high income, as part of the retirement package, to have more coming from their own savings. It's a challenge, and in countries that depend largely only on savings, these countries face, as I said, challenges every step of the way. How to contribute, first, whether to contribute or not. Second is when you contribute, are you going to contribute every single year or not? How much are you going to contribute? And once you contribute, then you have these big questions. How do you invest the money? Even as economists don't know a proper question to that when we are doing it in our own accounts. Even if you do that, then you have to retire. You have a pile of money. What do you do with that pile of money? So there are lots of choices that are difficult, but it must be part of the package for what we think a modern retirement system, at least for those on the top. More of the retirement income should come from their own savings. For those at the bottom, we see lots of difficulties. We saw the last presentation was about financial inclusion. The same issues apply, information, education. So we have to be careful to assume that this will be a perfect solution that applies for everybody and for every country. And you ask another question.
The transnational option.
Oh, the transnational. So this is let's talk very specific about Europe. In Europe, there's some kind of transnational system already. If you work in some country, your credits will be valued in the other country. It's not perfect, and it could be improved. There is a dream of having, let's say, a world pension where you contribute and there will be a world institution that will control this. It will be very difficult for obvious reasons. But there is scope to try to make this better, especially because in places like Europe, this will encourage labor mobility. What you want to make sure is that your choices of where you work are not dependent on a pension. This applies for both employers and for countries. You want to make sure that when you decide a job, it's not only because of your pension system, and that if there's another job where you can be more productive, you will not stop going there because your pension rights will be lost. This is what happens in some countries. I think in Europe there is some mobility. This happens at some levels of the benefit formulas, but there is some mobility because credits are transferable between some countries within some limits. I know there are initiatives to do this more of an international, and at this point it's mostly bilateral agreements between countries, where if you work, say in the US, they will be having agreements with several countries where your credits, the number of years of contribution, are counted for your pension here. But that's not a full solution, because when you're thinking about a new job, you're not necessarily thinking about your pension. This could be done in a better way.
Any other questions? We have time probably for one more. Yeah, please.
Valentina Flammini from the IMF. So you touched upon pension reforms, but your slide there also included healthcare spending, fiscal spending. So I was wondering, what about healthcare reform to reduce costs?
Yes. So, thank you, Valentina. That's a very good question. The question is, we touch on pensions and healthcare, but most of the other questions have been about pensions. So what about healthcare? So first, let me just say something about healthcare that is important. We package them together, but the challenge is really very country by country. Pension is the one that might be most visible, but the real long-term risk for many countries, at least in the advanced economies, is healthcare. There have been many of these reforms that I mentioned in the advanced economies, where they lower benefits, increase retirement ages. And if you look at their pension spending, it's not projected to increase dramatically. But their healthcare expenditure is projected to increase very fast. This is because if we look back, healthcare expenditure per capita has been growing at a rate that is faster than GDP per capita. So you have the two things diverging. Healthcare is perhaps one of the few areas where technology increases cost of the government. If you think of computers, price of computers have been coming down. In healthcare, as you bring new technologies, depending on how you arrange your system, this can increase your cost dramatically. And that's what we have observed in many countries. So what can you do? This is trickier because this is not, there's not a simple formula and it depends on the system. But we see merits in three types of reform. The first type is increase competition, but real competition among providers and some insurers. This is complicated because you need really better information, better sharing, and a really strong regulatory environment. But it's one of the solutions, and we see when countries do this, costs tend to slow down. The second one is preventive care. Many countries do not spend, and maybe they don't have the resources today, to engage in preventive care. This is something that in the long term can reduce cost. And the third one that is promising is information technology. It is absurd that today, with so many technology that we have, that is used for so many other areas, things like medical records are not easily shared across providers. And we see that this makes a difference because when we see countries that have only one system where the history is available to most providers, we see lower cost. So we see these three areas as being promising, but we are also skeptic because this is an area where reforms are not clear that they can deliver sustainable and they can bend the growth rate of expenditure. There are reforms that we observe that they can lower spending, but it's not clear that they can change the path. And those are the three areas that we consider.
Great. Well, with that, thank you so much, Mauricio. We're going to conclude this session. If you liked what you heard, there's another session coming up on a tangential conversation on the impact of Europe's aging population on productivity. So feel free to stick around for that. That starts at 4. We have 4 more sessions of the Analytical Corner tomorrow, if you're here. And Mauricio, thank you so much.
Thank you.